Derek from Revival Central, East London, South Africa. On my Facebook page, I have a photo of myself with a book, holding a book called Experiencing the Depths of Jesus Christ by Madame Guyon, Jean Guyon. Today I'm going to read just a little from this book, just showing you how important it is and its significance in history. This book has one of the most incredible histories of any book ever written. This book made its first appearance in France in about 1685. This is in the 1600s. Immediately God used it as an instrument to stir believers all over France. Opposition was also immediate. You are holding in your hand a book that has been publicly burnt. Nonetheless, its popularity has always equaled its opposition. For instance, a group of Roman Catholic priests came into the town of Guyon, France, where the Lord was touching many lives through this book. The priests opposed to both the book and the work of the Lord being done in Guyon, went door to door and gathered up a total of 300 copies and burnt them. 300 copies of one book is a remarkable number to be found in one town during the 1700s. One Frenchman took 1,500 copies and passed them out all over his community. As a result, the whole town was profoundly affected. Of all Jean Guyon's writings, she is best remembered for her autobiography and for this little work, Experiencing the Depths of Jesus Christ. But it was this work, now entitled Experiencing the Depths of Jesus Christ, which provoked the political and religious system of her day to launch out against her. Okay, sorry about that. I'm just skipping over a little bit of the text here. Along with the copy of the book she wrote, entitled Song of Songs, this book was placed in the hands of Louis XIV as evidence that she should be arrested. Later, before a religious tribunal, her writings were cited as the main evidence against her. On the basis of this book, she was denounced as a heretic and imprisoned, eventually in the infamous Bastille. Such was the history of this book during the lifetime of Jean Guyon. But that was no more than a starter. The men and movements that Jean Guyon has influenced would themselves fill volumes. I will cite a few. Shortly after her death, it appears the early Quakers began using this book, and probably more than any other single piece of literature, it affected their whole movement. In fact, through the Quaker movement, though the Quaker movement was over 100 years old before it came upon this book, Guyon probably influenced the Quakers spiritually as much as did their founder George Fox. Next to be influenced by this book was Zinzendorf, that's Count Zinzendorf, and the Moravians. Still later, an earnest young man named John Wesley read the book along with Jean Guyon's other works and was profoundly moved by it. Its influence on his life partly explains his deep piety and spiritual depth. One thing I'll mention here is that John Wesley was returning, I think, to England, and he was in a ship, and at this time I don't think he was really saved, even though he was I think ministering to certain people, and he came back on the ship, and there was a storm, if I remember correctly, and the lives of the people on the ship were in danger because of the storm. And there were certain people aboard, Moravians, that possessed such the peace, the presence of God was, they weren't moved by the storm, and they showed what it was really to have, as a Christian, how to live, and that one's not influenced by danger, and how one really lived in this place of a supernatural peace, and they had a real walk with Jesus Christ. And John Wesley, as a young man, when he was on the ship, he saw this, and he realized that he himself needed to be saved. And it's quite interesting that what I've just read here is, it says next to be influenced by the book was Zinzendorf and the Moravians. So the Moravians on that ship were influenced by Jean Guyon. The very works, they had the foundation. These people in the ship that John Wesley saw, they had the foundation, the truth of experiencing the depths of Jesus Christ. They had this foundation. And he saw that, John Wesley, and he realized he wasn't saved. And later on, when he became saved, this work, what was behind the Moravians, Jean Guyon and her work, especially experiencing the depths of Jesus Christ, what's in this book, had a profound influence on John Wesley's ministry and the Methodists. This is really what's behind the Methodists. Every Methodist should have a copy of Experiencing the Depths of Jesus Christ. But not only the Methodists, every Christian should have a copy of this. But most people today do not have the revelation of what they had. The Lord really has to reveal this to you, the importance of it, and how it needs to be the very foundation in your life. Next, let's just move on. The holiness movement of the late 1800s, with its emphasis on sanctification, must trace its genesis through Wesley to this book and its author. The charismatic movement, which began in the early 1900s with its awesome power and incredible shallowness, signaled the end of the forward thrust of the holiness movement and an emphasis on spiritual depth among the many offshoots of Wesleyanism. So we see here that's the importance that even as charismatics, having the baptism in the Holy Spirit, which is important for the normal development of a Christian walk, we still need to have this foundation. We need to have this foundation of Jean Guyon. And this book, I would say, is probably the most important book to me other than the scriptures, because of the truth and what's in it. It was so important that Watchman Nee, infected Hudson Taylor Watchman Nee, Watchman Nee had this translated into Chinese, and he felt that his followers, all the people in China that were under his ministry, needed this to be their foundation. It's so important to have a sound foundation in Jesus Christ, and there's nobody that could teach it better than Jean Guyon. And she could be the most influential woman in the history of the church. And one thing to note, that even though this book is so important, I've come across people in even the charismatic movement, and that they've dismissed some of the works as New Age and as meditation or something like that, and it's just simply not true. They haven't grasped the truth of the work and the abiding in Him. Sometimes in the charismatic movement, what happens, we can have it's all with the Word. We go too much into the Word sometimes. Sometimes it's Jesus, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Scriptures, and we worship the Scriptures. And we have so much with the letter, but we've lost the substance of it. And sometimes we're so shallow. We've become so shallow in our doctrine, and we have so much doctrine and so much theology, and we think in our eyes we have it all. We're so rich, we're full of these things, and yet we can be so blind that there's a dimension that we know nothing about, and it's a foundation that Jean Guyon and people in the past had. They take you from being a soulish Christian to being a spiritual Christian, where from the soul is the mind, will, and the emotions. Sometimes we become too intellectual as Christians, too much with theology and doctrine, or we become emotional. We become soulish, and not spiritual. And there's a vast difference with being someone that's spiritual and through the presence of God manifests the truth to someone that just brings an intellectual sermon across. And this is really, really important. And there's just nothing like it. I've studied church history. I've studied through the ages. I've studied the roots where this comes from. I've gone right into from the Catholic side. There were certain people that came out of the Catholic Church that weren't happy sometimes, and they were seeking the Lord. They were seeking more, and God started to reveal truth to them. So there's a long history with this, but of all the people, her work has been the one that has stood the test of time. It's the one that John Wesley, Hudson Taylor, Watchman Nee, they all put their stamp of approval on it. If they accepted this and they thought this was so important, shouldn't we? Should we reject the works of Jean Guyon? If these Christians, who are some of the most famous and the most well-known Christians in church history, they said this work was so important, should we ignore it? There's also something I would like to just share with you. I don't know if I'll find it now. But basically, it says here that it's one thing to read this book. You can even teach on this book and these principles. But that's not enough. It's something else for this book, the truth in the book, to become your foundation. And your only foundation. In other words, it's not something you just read once and just pass over it and even minister on it and then move to something else. This actually, the truth of this book needs to be your foundation for life, your very foundation as a Christian. And when it's your foundation, it will affect everything. Your relationships with other people will affect your doctrine. Everything will be affected and influenced by this. That's why this is such an important book. The truth is so important. And Watchman Nee, he understood this. He saw that this book was translated into Chinese and made available to every new convert of the little flock. Fenelon, Count Zinzendorf, John Wesley, the early Quakers, J.C. Penrose, and Hudson Taylor all highly recommended it to the believers of their day. This book will introduce you to a whole new and deep relationship to Jesus Christ. I just thought I'd share this bit with the history of this. Because today, sometimes in the church, you've got people that are saying things that they really know nothing about. They sometimes dismiss Jean Guyon. Sometimes in history, she gets a badge. She's referred to as a quietist, and they put this terminology and put her in a kind of box, or say it's New Age, and they don't really understand things really properly. But really, this is probably the most important book other than the scriptures that you could have. And that's one that I would really, really recommend. And I would say more than anything else that not only last 30 years, but it will be right until the Lord comes. This will be the most important truth that I've ever come across. It's really actually the truth of the Sermon on the Mount. It's really just expanding on the Sermon on the Mount. It's really just showing you really what Jesus meant on the Sermon on the Mount. And he spoke of all this actually there. Just brings it forth in a way that makes it much clearer. And this is really the heart of the gospel. And when this is true in your life, then the Beatitudes are true in your life. That's almost Jesus' version of the fruit of the Spirit. Beatitudes. But they are only true in your life if you have this foundation. That's why it's so important. And truly then you'll only be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. How can you be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, if you don't have this foundation? Impossible. So if you find ministries that don't have this foundation, you'll find that they're not the salt of the earth. They're not the light of the world. This is why America has fallen. Why has America gone the way it has? Jonathan Cahn, in his book The Harbinger, brings forth this from 9/11 right through how America has fallen, how it's departed from God. And it's because the church has failed. In America has failed to be the salt and the light. And it's failed to be the salt of America and the light of America because they've not had this foundation. If they had the truth that's in this book, experiencing the depths of Jesus Christ, they would have been the salt of America. They would have been the light of America. America would have not gone the way it has today. It's because of the foundation. And we can see how important this is. Not only now, but I believe in the move of God that's to come. That the people that are going to be moving in the power of God and the anointing in this end time revival, they must all have this foundation. This is the key. This is the secret. The key for what is to come. God bless. It's Derek from Revival Central, East London, South Africa.